You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do Mini. I'm your host, Abraham.
And I'm Shane.
This is a short form series that we do where we take a smallish, bite-sized topic, we unpack it really quickly, and then we get out of there so we can let you go about your day. And go.
Yes, so today is hors d'oeuvres, right? That's what we call them. Okay, wait. I'm saying hors d'oeuvres because they're just a snack, right? That's what we're doing. All right, so
there you go.
Our discussion today. Fallacies are arguments that appear to be legitimate and are often convincing, but when examined closely, or even just like a little tiny little bit amount, you can actually determine that these arguments are poor or even flat out wrong.
This can be done accidentally, or as often is the case, they can be used to trick you into believing something. Politicians basically only speak in logical fallacies, it seems like.
And many times illogical fallacies, so that's always fun.
Yeah.
So there's informal logical fallacies. These are statements or arguments based in language that are unsound, illogical, or inaccurate because the content of the argument, not just the structure or form of the argument, is bad, right? So it's just the argument itself is bad, as is the case with the formal logical fallacies.
Yes. So this is an informal. The one we're talking about today is informal. There are formal. Here's an example of a formal logical fallacy. One that's called affirming the consequent, or modus ponens is how I've heard it described in Latin. I mean, that's a formal logical fallacy. And it goes like this. If A, then B, B, therefore A. And here's an example of how that's sort of the logical symbolic representation of how it works. So let's do it this way. If immigrants come into our country, there will be more crime. That might be a premise that someone states as part of an argument. If immigrants come into our country, there'll be more crime. That's A. B, there is more crime as an observation. So C, therefore immigrants have come into our country. Like, that's an informal logical fallacy. Just because you make the premise, which may or may not be true, and then you have an observation of an outcome, which may or may not be true, then you imply the premise, which again may or may not be true. And that doesn't actually make logical sense to do. And I think that example should unpack that relatively well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one such informal logical fallacy is the middle of the road logical fallacy. So this fallacy is the argument that the middle of two extreme positions is the truth, or most likely to be true, which is so fun. It's like the three sides to every story, right?
Yeah, so let's take this example. We'll have a little debate with each other. Part A, we should kill all of the dogs in the world.
Oh, Abraham. Well, my argument is we should kill none of the dogs in the world.
Okay, so then a logical position is the middle of the road. We should kill half of the dogs in the world.
Oh, that's bad.
No, that's bad. That is clearly wrong. Don't kill dogs unless it's an act of compassion. That is, they're dying, they can't be saved, they're in extreme pain, that sort of thing. We don't kill dogs. No killing of the dogs.
Yeah, we don't advocate for that here. Yeah, unless that's there.
Yeah, it's just the sort of act of compassion version of that, which is rare and sometimes necessary, but not the go-to for anything.
Right.
Let's unpack some less clear examples of a middle-of-the-road logical fallacy.
Some argue that electric cars are better for the environment.
Some argue that electric cars are worse for the environment.
So it's probable that electric cars are neither better nor worse for the environment. They put out a neutral net positive or neutral net negative. They're neutral as an output.
It's neutral, yeah. It's net neutral. This may or may not be true, depending on how you choose to slice and dice it, but the argument itself is not sound, is the problem here. Just because there are two polar opposite positions does not mean that therefore the middle position is accurate. But by the way, just by pretty much every available metric, electric cars are better for the environment. We'll just get that out of the road. But suffice it to say, people will use this to create polar opposite positions so that they can then move their position to the middle of those, which is still wrong, and claim that it's legitimate because it's between two extremes.
Well, right. And I think, as I'm kind of listening to this, it's like, okay, so one extreme is wrong. The other extreme is wrong. The middle one is not it's like a perfect melding of the two, which makes it wrong because it's still in itself extreme by making like such grandiose claims.
Yeah.
Right. Like in itself is like not generalizable.
Exactly right. Yeah. It's like just because they're two extreme positions doesn't mean that one of the they're partially right in any direction. A is wrong. B is right. C is ads.
So let's consider a different type of example. So let's say carcinogens cause cancer.
I'll say instead that genetics cause cancer.
Well, then the middle of the road would be that carcinogens and genetics can cause cancer. And this is an example that highlights that the conclusion can be definitely true, but the argument itself is flawed, right? So we can make the argument that carcinogens and genetics together can be higher risk, but the argument to get there doesn't make any sense. It's not reasonable to say that carcinogens and genetics cause cancer because that is the middle position between the two different statements. It just happens to be the case that both are true.
I think it's worth just pointing out, like, sometimes the middle of the road is the right position, but not because it's the middle of the road. It just happens to be the right position. Also, sometimes, most times, probably all times, there are really more than two options that can exist. So, like, it doesn't have to be, like, sometimes painting that there are two extremes. It's actually another logical fallacy called a false dichotomy. So worth considering that.
Right. Ooh, let's unpack a psychological example because, we are a psychology podcast, so we should be talking about that. So
presumably,
we discovered that we're a history podcast recently, so there's that.
True.
So let's say behavior is determined by cognitive processes.
And I'm going to say behavior is determined by environmental processes.
Then we would say middle of the road, behavior is determined by both cognitive and environmental processes. And a lot of people will hear this and think, that makes perfect sense. I could totally buy this, but it's wrong.
Right. And the premise of the question is incorrect. Cognitive processes are behavioral processes. They are part of our behavior. There are things that we do. They're part of interaction with the environment, so they are behavior. Simply superimposing this truth into the argument highlights the deficiency in the argument itself. Because if we simply replace the word cognitive with behavior because they are behaviors, then the argument becomes behavior is determined by behavior processes.
Right. And then behavior is determined by environmental processes, which then leads to it's not true because A is not true to begin with.
Right. So the point of this discussion is to point out how people can use these arguments to try and trick you, or you may use these arguments to trick yourself into believing something, but by using flawed logical method. And definitely many people they'll create extreme positions, again, like in politics, so that they can then land in a middle position saying this is the right place to be. And that it's still a very extreme position relative to one of those premises, but they've made it seem less extreme by comparing it to something even more extreme. And then highlighting it as being true because it's the middle of the road. Don't be hoodwinked by these liars. That is all I got. Anything you got, Shane?
Nothing else. That nailed it.
Thank you for listening. Why We Do What We Do Mini is out.
Bye.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.